This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, cultural workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Kimberly Thomas McNair, who teaches in the Department of African and African American Studies at Stanford University. She teaches widely in literature, gender studies, and cultural studies inside the Black studies tradition, and is completing a book manuscript titled Every Goodbye Ain't Gone, T-Shirt Culture and the Black Activist Tradition. In this conversation, we discuss the unique character of Black studies, relations of disciplines, and the non-disciplinary character of the field, and the intersection of politics, memory, and cultural studies in the history of Black social activism. Hello, Kimberly. How are you today?
I am well, John. How are you?
I'm great, actually. I'm about a week and a half out from teaching. I know we were talking about this a little bit beforehand. You've already been teaching, so I feel a little guilty saying that, but I'm in the blissful ignorance phase of the new year. And I've been really looking forward to this conversation. I've said this a handful of times on the podcast when I've hosted guests with your same background, educational background. It's so important for us in this podcast to have people who have PhDs in the field of Black studies. And you're also someone who was Black studies from the very beginning, from BA through PhD. So it's a special treat to have you on the podcast for that reason. Also, just really interested to hear you talk about your research, your interests, your vision of the field, and all of that. So welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, John, and thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here and be in conversation with you.
Well, we'll have a chance, of course, to talk about your research and your vision of the field and how these things fit together and how you think about the past and future of Black studies. But I wanted to start really with a more personal question and ask you, what got you interested in Black studies? How were you drawn to the study of Black life? And what keeps you committed to and sustains you in relation to this field?
Okay, great question. Well, for starters, I am from Eastern North Carolina. I am from a small town. It's not the smallest town, but it's small enough. Kinston, North Carolina, in Lenoir County. And so I'm from a rural and an urban background, majority Black town, around 70% Black. And I lived on the blackest part of that town. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up noticing that Black and white neighborhoods were separated by Vernon Avenue in the north, so those in the southeastern quarter of the town and the county were all African American and all in what we call them under-resourced.
Mm-hmm.
And systemically neglected areas, but it was my community, it was my home. And I grew up in a family that saw African American history and African American culture as very important. My mother did not graduate high school. My father graduated high school but didn't go to college. So I'm first generation college educated. First generation for my mom, high school graduate, and my sister and I both went off to college at the same time. But when I was young, my mom loved to watch African American history documentaries, right? So not just Eyes on the Prize. I mean, we would stake out in front of the television on the weekend and just watch PBS all weekend long, right? I even had a grandfather, my grandfather Bo. His name's Sylvester Thomas. And he would love to watch the documentaries about cowboys and the Civil War, and he was a World War II veteran as well. And so even though it wasn't in the most written format, because of course there are varying levels of literacy in my community as well as my family, the format of documentary and storytelling was something that interest my family, especially my mother, in our household. And African American history was something that I was exposed to, not only because of that family inclination, but also my community, being majority African American. We just knew certain elements of history and had certain traditions in terms of storytelling, in terms of reciting poems and scripture, in oration, in our churches and in our community centers. That I'm happy to say I'm of that generation where I remember memorizing and reciting James Weldon Johnson poems and Langston Hughes poems and um, the one person that had to recite all of MLK's "I Have a Dream" speech on MLK holiday and for Black History Month. So my interest in Black history really starts in my family. The idea that not only should you know the history of your people, but family history and your roots. It matters that they taught us where we came from and where our ancestors were from and what they endured. And I took that interest in African American history with me throughout school, K through 12, and into undergrad when I'm venturing into an area that my parents can't really help me with, choosing a college and choosing a major. And so, like anyone else that, of my generation, my parents wanted me to go off to school and earn a degree in a trade, right? You
Sure.
you have to gain a skill and come back and work in that area, right? So the idea of liberal arts was something that they didn't quite understand, going off to college
Mhm,
and having
mhm.
all these questions and exploring
Sure, sure.
exploring all these topics. No, they like go off, earn a skill, and then you come back and you work. And so I went with the intention of double majoring in chemistry and chemical engineering. And I received a full scholarship, academic scholarship for chemistry and chemical engineering. And that paid for my entire education in undergrad. All 4 years was paid for because I eventually, junior year, I dropped the chemical engineering major. But I was able to retain that scholarship because I kept the chemistry major. And by that time, I'd already fallen in love with Africana studies, African American history, and added added the major because just so happens at my alma mater, North Carolina State University, we had to take so many classes in humanities as a STEM major. You might as well get the minor.
Oh,
And
okay.
by the time I'd already accomplished enough Africana studies classes for a minor. I just needed one more year to add the core classes for the major and graduate with that degree. And I was already rethinking my career path, rethinking whether or not I wanted to go and practice in the area of chemical engineering and chemistry, go off and be a chemist. And I was very, very passionate about Africana studies, not just because of what we were discussing in the classroom, but because of the application
Mm,
of it.
mhm.
Outside of the classroom, I saw clearly that, as I say it, Black studies lives in the real world.
Yeah.
And that is what hooked me. I started with a curiosity. Um, I didn't know what I could do with a Black studies degree necessarily coming out of undergrad. I thought, okay, I'll go work in a not for profit, So I worked for the Democratic Party for a season, and then I went off and I taught language arts at my middle school that I actually came from, my middle school.
Hmm.
But I didn't know exactly what could be done with a Black Studies degree, but I knew that I wanted to do something in organizing and in working to better communities like the ones I came from. But then, I had these questions. I had questions that I wanted answers to, these intellectual curiosities about why the world was set up the way that it was, right? Why did it seem like Black people were marginalized? And I learned that terminology, marginalization. That's something I had to learn,
Mm,
right?
mhm.
But in order to even begin to interrogate the questions, that required a master's degree. Okay, to even think about how am I forming the questions. I know that I have curiosities, but now I have questions.
Hmm.
And I want to know where's the research that helps me understand these issues, these topics in a deeper manner. for the sake of application. I still wanted to take that master's degree and go off and work in a not-for-profit, go off and work in a community organization that was set to address issues facing Black communities. And I went off and got the Afro-American Studies master's at UCLA. And I used that degree at UCLA. I worked at UCLA for a season or two in a couple positions. And I found myself not just having questions, but I wanted to, for myself, garner the skills to answer those questions.
Mm-hmm.
So I need a method now. I need to understand method, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I need to, understand evidence, sources, things like that. And that's what prompted me to go off and get the PhD. I had applied for a sociology PhD at my undergraduate alma mater, and I was accepted. I even was accepted to law school at UC Davis. But I eventually, applied for the Black Studies PhD at several institutions, but my top choice ended up, accepting me, and that was UC Berkeley. And I went there and got the PhD in African American and African diaspora studies. And so from Africana studies to Afro American studies to African American and African diaspora studies, understanding what these names mean,
Mm-hmm.
understanding
Mm-hmm.
which specific intellectual traditions within Black studies that all of these programs and departments are actually pulling from, and what they consider foundational and what they consider canon, like what are the canonical texts, informing how I garnered the skills to go about undertaking my own research to answer these questions, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so that's really what propelled me into going further in Black studies in particular. It all started from a fire that was lit in me by my family. Being a very observant young lady, and noticing that things are different on my side of town, and having the culture shock of going off to Raleigh,
Mm-hmm.
having the culture shock coming from a 70% Black town to the campus, North Carolina State University, having a bigger cultural shock going off to Los Angeles,
Yeah.
and then graduating and working in Los Angeles as a little country girl from Eastern North Carolina, and then coming up to the Bay Area. And honestly, in the Bay Area, I felt the most at home away from home because I lived in Oakland. And I found a lot of connections with community in Oakland, California in particular.
Mm-hmm.
So those are some of the things that have shaped my understanding of Black studies by way of my own experiences and what it meant to get a degree in a field that came from community demand, demand from communities like the ones that birthed me, and what it means, what that intellectual tradition means, and also what the legacy means to Black people who are not in the academy.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, I think I speak for most people who listen and are guests on the podcast. Is like a real favorite part of these conversations of hearing how people end up in this field and the kinds of things that move them to the study of Black life and keep them connected to it. And I'm just really moved by the presence of documentary and television. That I think there's this. I mean, at least in my classrooms, I get my students to talk about, what is Black study if it's not just simply reading books for class, right? And where does that happen? And I like the addition of this, of sitting on a Sunday and watching PBS. I mean, that's real. I mean, I can only imagine the kinds of conversations that come from that linger, that impact people in all those different kinds of ways across generations. So that's just a really amazing trajectory. And, ending up from in Los Angeles, when you said a culture shock, we only recorded the audio. I wish we had the video when you said the culture shock then of moving to Los Angeles. It's a very, very different cultural shift. For what it's worth, I moved from Seattle, Washington to Memphis and had my own version of that. I was like,
Mhm.
they're really different in Memphis than in Seattle. But,
Mhm.
part of the actually, I think probably kind of connected to that, all those different ways of doing Black studies, right? It's also like regions and orientations. But
Right.
I'm going on and on just because I found that this completely fantastic story. And I also want to underscore that they made you, as a STEM major, take humanities classes. I love that.
Yeah, that was serious at NC State. Like it was amazing the amount of units we needed to graduate. So I had the chemistry and chemical engineering double major, and the university made a point for STEM majors. I don't even know if we were calling it STEM then, but for the majors in engineering and the physical and mathematical sciences to take a significant, like it was like 21, 27 units or something like that,
That's
and
amazing.
you only needed about 21 units for a minor. So if you chose strategically, you could end up with a minor in one of the humanities on campus. And on the flip side, for we call it CHAS, the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, but all of the humanities and social science fields, for their general education requirements, they had to take certain, physical and mathematical sciences, and then they could move on. But statistics and things like that, they also were required to take those. It was a well-rounded education at NC State. I really appreciated. I actually got a chance to be a Benjamin Franklin scholar, because I had the engineering major and the humanities major in Africana Studies, and we had a special program that kinda helped mold our minds
Hmm. Hmm.
around being persons in those they're not as distinct as people would believe. It helped me understand disciplinarity in an
Hmm.
interesting way. But yes, I benefited from that experience.
Also, first of all, chemical engineering, I could not have less of an idea what that's about. So when you said chemical
Yeah.
engineering, I was like, how do you go from understanding what chemical engineering is to Black studies? So I was like totally
Mhm.
gripped by that. I was like, I don't know where
Mhm.
that twist is. But
Mhm.
which is also interesting to me that, the way even you laid out the progression from BA to MA to PhD was very much like a series of, like, I had a kind of question or an orientation that got some satisfaction, but made me have new things, like the way you move from curiosity to questions to methods. And
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
I really love that. It kind of sounds like what I imagine an engineering project is like. But
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I was an engineering major for 3 years, of my undergraduate experience, and I think it's interesting. I chuckle. I think it's funny that certain folk from specific, disciplines, especially in the physical and mathematical science, they scoff at the idea that those disciplines might be interdisciplinary. Or they kind of don't understand the idea of interdisciplinarity when you think about STEM. I think that's odd because we were required to take biochemistry, and I'm like, biochemistry,
yeah,
you
yeah,
know, um,
that's
that's
literally an enter in the
yeah,
name.
it really is, and then other areas like bioscience engineering and things like that that are very much multidisciplinary and pulling from, specific disciplines, to answer questions. So it is right there, and the way I understand it, it is right there. And physics is one of the most interdisciplinary, disciplines in physical and mathematical sciences that I can recall. So when I went and got the MA, and then went off to get the PhD, I was always thinking about, okay, what is the scientific method that I remember had 7 to 8 steps,
Mm, mhm,
you
yeah,
know? Hypotheses, observations, conclusions, that whole
yeah,
7
yeah.
step, 7 to 8 step, and so when we started to talk about methods, I was like, "Okay, so we're gonna have this 7 to 8 step situation that that's similar
Yeah.
in STEM," and no, not necessarily.
Mhm.
Not necessarily, right? So it was an education, and it did actually help shape the way I understood what we were doing in terms of method and where do we go for the evidence and how do we interpret that evidence and what, that sort of thing. So I think that a lot of that has stayed with me through the PhD into my profession, but it has best served me when engaging with STEM students in my classrooms.
Mm, mhm. Yeah, you get a different kind of credibility there than somebody like me. I did a great books liberal arts program, and the one time we walked through a lab, I was nauseated by the smell of formaldehyde and
Mhm,
decided maybe the humanities were only for me. But it's led to this huge gap in these kinds of insights that you're talking about. And
mhm.
I mean, I'm fine with my education; it just is what it is. But I love that. I love that it wasn't your break from science. It was this, lessons in each direction, right? And
Mhm.
that comment about the sciences and interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary, that's fantastic. I love that. Yeah.
Great. Good. Well, thank you.
Let me ask you about Black Studies then specifically, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on sort of how you imagine the field, what's a portrait of the field you work with, and I ask this in the context of the origins of the field, which was the demands that sort of come from two directions that are in some form of tension, right? One is the intellectual demand that students had that the Black intellectual tradition, Black life be represented on campus. And the disciplines hadn't really adequately addressed that. And so Black studies was going to be where you went to study, Black history, Black literature, Black sociology, and art, and so forth. And I think that lives in our portrait of Black studies today as committed to a certain kind of intellectual tradition, and sometimes it's more expansive in different places than others. But that commitment to intellectual life. But of course, this is all taking place in the late 1960s and early 1970s during the radicalization of Black liberation struggle, where those kinds of distinctions between intellectual life and political life, between campus and community, between books, study, prescriptive action, and mobilization, those boundaries really were contested, if not outright obliterated, in so many places and so many sites of struggle. And I think that political demand of Black studies also lives in the demand that Black study have a kind of commitment to community, a kind of commitment to a certain vision of liberation and prescriptive sort of political sensibility. And I think there's a tension there in terms of emphasis. They also have a relationship. So, sort of in that context, that's sort of overly elaborated narrative from me. I'm interested to hear how you think about the field of Black studies. What's your portrait that guides you?
So I'm as I'm listening to you, ask the question, what I'm hearing is, what is Black studies for you? And how am I situating my work within what Black studies, like the purpose of Black studies?
Yeah, what is it? What is that
Mm,
purpose? What
mhm,
guides you in the sense of this is makes this field of study purposeful?
great. I usually have this conversation with my students in some of the intro classes and with my peers who also have Black studies degrees and thinking about, okay, all right, now what's the project? What are we doing here?
Yeah.
Okay, what
Hmm.
what are we doing? What we have to do is find a reconcile two things. Um, yes, Black studies came from community demand, but that community was demand was made possible after decades of a Black intellectual movement outside of the academy, right? That influenced political and social movements outside the academy, and that community demand birthing these programs and departments on college campuses. So going from, I'm thinking about Manning Marable, where he talks about the whole Black studies as descriptive, corrective, and prescriptive, right? And
Yeah.
so looking at Du Bois, thinking about the descriptive, and looking at people like Carter G. Woodson as, the corrective, right? How do we correct the image of Black people, not only in the white mind, but in the Black mind, right? With the miseducation of the Negro. And then thinking about prescriptive, right? So we are thinking about the history and intellectual traditions and practices of Black people in the United States and abroad, but Black people in the United States. But we need solutions to real world problems that Black people are facing. All of this coming about in the Jim Crow period, what we're understanding as going back in and taking Frederick Douglass's narratives and taking the speeches of people like Maria Stewart and Anna Julia Cooper, but really, these are all responses and happening in real time where we have mass lynchings and campaigns that are destroying the image of Black people, right? Representations of Black people. So prescriptive in a sense. How are we taking these analytical lenses that we are theorizing and apply them to solve the issues facing Black America in particular, right? But then we come to this moment where, through community demand, we have the establishment of programs and departments. And I'm thinking about Nathan Haar, right, at San Francisco State University, which talked about, Black studies education, right? So we go from Black studies as an intellectual movement over decades and thinking about it in terms of Black studies education on college campuses, what should it do? Two phases. You have the expressive phase, which is really recuperative of the self and the psyche, the psychology of Black students, right? Teaching them their history, celebrating Black culture, right? Doing that in terms of courses and classrooms. And you have a second phase, which is pragmatic, pragmatic, positivistic. I think that's pragmatic, okay? And that basically, we want them to get skills.
Mhm.
We want them to garner skills and training to help them graduate and go off into their professions and again address real world issues facing Black America. And a lot of that onus coming from the political thrust of that time, where understanding that we're calling this Black studies, that's not just a political statement. That's a stake, right? And saying we're going to do this in quote the academy, right? The way I see that right now is reconciling the beginning history of Black studies as an intellectual movement and Black studies arriving in the academy on college campuses in terms of, oh, what do we do in college?
Mhm, mhm.
We do some particular things in college, right? And thinking about that in terms of right now, we have programs and departments that credential people. These are credentials. This is professionalization. So, how are we reconciling the onus towards having careers and a profession in Black studies, in the academy, or things that are adjacent to the academy, museums and think tanks and otherwise, being people with degrees minted in Black studies and in that tradition, right? But also still this need to go back and reclaim that sacred stance of no, there is a community commitment. There is a community commitment that is inherent in Black studies. So one of the pillars of Black studies, we have to make these things make sense on the ground, and we are not just credentialing people to go out and work somewhere.
Yeah.
There is a purpose to Black studies that does include um, solving problems, solving issues, and not just celebratory education where we explore and talk about Black people and Black culture. That is to minimalize what Black studies is. There was a broader purpose of it in that it's some real world issues
Yeah.
that Black people face and we are still facing in 2026. And Black studies is definitely the type of field where you can take these analytical lenses and add that to what I call your bag of tools.
Mhm,
I tell my
mhm.
students you got a bag of tools and you have an issue or a problem and you might pull out intersectionality. All right. Or you might pull out Afro-pessimism, or you might
Mhm.
pull out Afrofuturism, whatever your analytical lens might be. Let's pull out the paradigm of Afrocentricity, helping us to understand not being Eurocentric and how we are laying out whatever our project is. But with that bag of tools, those analytical lenses, right, we can actually apply them. So I stress applied Africana studies,
Mhm.
right? And having courses and projects for students that it's not just a final paper. I expect them to create something. If we're going to have a class where we talk about Black feminism and media representations, we are going to participate in media making as a
Mhm,
final
mhm.
project. If we're talking about activism in Black communities, then I will pair students with community organizations where they can work with those community organizations, and making the course content relate to what they are doing with these community organizations, so on and so forth. So that's really how I view Black studies. That is how I understand it and how I try to, professionally as an instructor and as a researcher, how I am understanding the writing and the research that I do, as well as my pedagogy, right? And how that's informed in terms of that is my idea of Black studies. We are not sociology. We're
Mhm.
not, though we might engage in some sociological methods, right? And we are in conversation with concepts and work coming out of sociology and philosophy and psychology, so on and so forth. But adhering to that intellectual tradition and what was already laid out for us, descriptive, corrective, prescriptive. I want to stress the prescriptive piece,
Mhm.
and that is not just abstract theorizing. There is application, there is praxis. Not everyone has to do that. Not everyone has to focus on the prescriptive and pragmatic. Okay, we have to have variety in our courses and
Mhm.
variety in what we intend to do with these degrees, but we can't let go of that piece, and help students understand that that is a part of it.
Mm. That's thank you for that. That's a beautiful outline of both the power and the responsibility of Black studies. Thank you for that. That was a fantastic detail. I have these moments in every podcast where I'm like, the whole thing's worth it even just for that. I mean, it's for these other things too, but I love that. I mean, it shows, first of all, it shows your BA through PhD background in Black studies, but there's so much there that thoughtfully weaves together the responsibilities to intellectual traditions, to communities, to politics, both inside and outside the classroom and inside and outside our writing. So, um,
Mhm.
and so let me sort of ask then a question that maybe connects that vision of Black studies to your own kind of to your own research and your approach to research. You work in, of course, in Black studies as a background, feminist sensibilities, cultural history, and this combination of orientations or sensibilities really is so crucial for the future of the field. And I'm interested how you think that your own research and research approach is situated in terms of the history of Black studies. So where does it fit, and or how do you think it pushes new horizons or new boundaries in the field?
Well, there's a lot going on with my with my book, and my research. I think that I might actually have a few elements, of all of these things, all these characteristics
Great.
in my work. My work focuses on t-shirt culture, coming out of Black protest movements, political movements over the past 60 or so years. So I look at t-shirts that were created as part of activist organizations or during specific movements from about 1965 to 2015. So I'm looking at the point from Black Power, right? The first Black Panther t-shirt all the way to the moment of the movement for Black Lives. Right. And t shirts coming out of the movement for Black Lives, and also discursive interventions being made online via hashtag activism.
Mhm.
And what do t shirts on the ground have to do with those discursive interventions? So, in terms of Black culture, really looking at clothing and Black expressive culture. What does that mean in terms of affinity groups in the Black Power era? Thinking about working class politics of respectability, and also thinking about in terms of movement strategy, what did clothing have to do with community organizing and building with community members in particular, and moving into the 1970s and 1980s with the birth of hip hop, and you have Panther Cubs and people who are the children
Mhm.
of those who participated in the Black Power era, hearkening back to this moment in social movement photography, utilizing images on their album covers and in their T-shirts and in their lyrics in hip hop in particular. And what does that say about what's happening in public schools around, clothing policy, right? Policy around appropriate attire in schools. What does that do in terms of the school to prison pipeline and how that affected Black boys and girls in particular? All of these things around T-shirts are really illustrating social points on the ground, right? How I interpret. who's featured on the t-shirts, right? And how we progress by way of technology from persons and organizations and symbols being featured on the t-shirts to hashtags being featured on the t-shirt, how that might show an ideological progression in movement organizing from thinking about rallying figures and leader centered organizing to group centered organizing,
Hmm.
right? And building a mass movement that doesn't have a specific idea of who the quintessential rallying figure should be, but broadens our understanding of how police brutality and extrajudicial murder affects the whole of the Black community. So I'm moving from one, and I identifying with Black feminism in these early Black Power era years, and also thinking about Black feminism and womanism, right? In terms of womanist practices and organizing through the early 2010s, and thinking about Say Her Name, thinking about the hashtag bulletproof t shirt, thinking about t shirts that feature things like all Black Lives Matter when they illustrate not just one kind of Black person, but all kinds of Black people, and their deaths at the hands of police and the state actors matter, right? And so that's what I'm doing in my research. I think that it is descriptive. It does outline a history. It does talk about these discursive interventions in the ways that Black people are understood as victims in popular culture and in mass media, mainstream media. There's also a conversation about public history and popular history. Who gets to be remembered? How do we remember them? How is history told and retold? By way of looking at T-shirts as public history, artifacts of public history, and spaces for public history education. In the moment of the Black Power era and now, right? What do T-shirts help us facilitate around memory work, right? And how is that a healing practice, right? How does that show care in terms of healing justice when we think about Black Lives Matter and Say Her Name, so on and so forth? That's what I'm doing. I have to situate my work in terms of evidence. Where do I go to find these t-shirts from 60 years ago? Do they
Yeah.
still
Yeah.
exist? Where do I go to find these t-shirts from the movement for Black Lives, right? I've been in people's closets. I've been in inventories,
Hmm.
in T-shirt projects and organizations. How do I interpret and make sense of how Black people are understanding these T-shirts? I had to talk to family members, right, of people who were lost at the hands of state actors and the police. I've talked to activists, and interviewed activists. I've interviewed people from the Black Panther Party, right, in terms of what my primary sources are. And to interpret those primary sources for secondary sources, again, I am looking to the Black intellectual tradition around these points in history, right? I'm looking at memoirs. I'm looking at the ways that Black people have documented, interpreted, and understood themselves in these moments as the secondary sources that I use to interpret that primary evidence. And that's how I've moved forward in this project. The book is called Every Goodbye Ain't Gone. Every Goodbye Ain't Gone, and is doing a bit around public history, popular history, cultural studies, as well as thinking about memorial practices, right?
Hmm.
Thinking about what people like Miriam Kaba calls active hope and intentional grieving. And where's the power in that, and whose voices are being amplified, and how are we doing that by way of black black feminism, but also womanist practices and spirituality. And so when I say that there's a lot going on, and
Yeah.
I am trying to do a lot in these chapters,
Good.
and I think that the message will be clear, in what and how I build on each chapter in that book. And I think that my idea and how I'm situating myself in Black studies is reflected in that, and definitely informed by not only past traditions, but what we're doing now in the present. I love to be in conversation with people like Jennifer Nash and Kimberly Crenshaw and Michelle Alexander and other scholars who are doing work that definitely involve application. How,
Hmm.
how are we applying these ideas?
So, I mean, talking about T-shirts as soon as you were talking about it, I was like, how has this not been a major theme in multiple books? I mean, it's a fascinating, and a window into so many things, and as soon as you said it, I thought, "Yeah, this is a really urgent project." So no pressure, but you gotta get this book done because we all need to read and learn from it. And, thinking about, I I know that there've been, books written on fashion and fashion history and so forth, but this is such a different thing because the T-shirt is, obviously a statement fashion piece, but it's also, as you said, it's just a common fashion piece in the sense that it's not you don't save up for well, you may save up for your T-shirt, but it is, it's informal wear. I don't know how else to put it.
Right, right. I think it's a democratic item
There
of
you go.
clothing. I wouldn't say ubiquitous, but I think it's something around the technology and how T-shirts are produced, be it a blank, plain T-shirt of various color or a T-shirt with an image or a slogan on it. The ways that we can access T-shirt is democratized,
Mhm.
to a certain extent, and I think one of the reasons why it hasn't been in my opinion, this is one of the interventions, is I really believe it hasn't been taken up as one of those artifacts where people have discussed T-shirts over time, um, is because of the ubiquitous nature of the T-shirt, and
Yeah.
this is an article of clothing that you purchase. These are images, souvenirs, and keepsakes that most people don't understand it outside of a capitalist framework, right? Not only is there commodity in Black Death via the media, news cycles, etc. There is a commodification in Black Death, but also thinking about Black History T-shirts that memorialize MLK, Malcolm X, Fred Hampton, and thinking about ways that, let's say, Trayvon Martin T-shirts, Mike Brown, and others, how those T-shirts also garnered a sense of commodity in terms of popular culture as well. So how do we understand this commodification of Black Death in a way that, for me, does not amplify the industry of it
Mhm.
all,
Yeah.
does not make the story about the capitalists and who's making money and who's profiting. How do we acknowledge that this is an industry, the apparel industry? T-shirts are apparel, in a certain aspect. That's what makes them good money makers for grassroots organizations that want to garner funds, and they fundraise through um, selling T-shirts, right? However, the story can't be about profit margins. The story is about what are T-shirts helping us facilitate in terms of consciousness raising, in
Mhm.
terms of
Mhm.
people becoming actively involved, not just through their affinity in wearing T-shirts. They are actively involved in grassroots movements. What do T-shirts help us facilitate in that conversation, helping people understand what the moments is about, right? And how does it then serve as generations looking back as artifacts that tell us something about this moment, right?
Yeah.
And so that's where I am. I think that's why people haven't taken it up, because we slip into this conversation about money and we lose the voices of the most impacted persons when these are T-shirts coming out of Black Lives Matter campaigns and
Yeah.
such, right?
It's interesting because I think it's probably, nothing's universal, but all but universal that we acquire clothing items, and keep them for memory, right? And why would a T-shirt be any different? Especially because you use that word souvenir. I mean, a souvenir is just a memory piece, right? And it can be a memory piece that's sort of light and kitschy. Oh, I remember when I wore this, or it can be this like this was a transformative moment. And it can be everything in between, so that's what a
Mhm,
memory piece, it can be all those things.
mhm. Memory objects, yeah,
I
yeah.
By the way, Every Goodbye Ain't Gone is one of maybe my favorite James Baldwin essay, so I encourage you to fight for that title when the publisher tries to change it, if they do.
Yes, thank you.
That's a great title.
Yes. Thank you.
I'm interested, just as also then a follow-up on that, your background is, from the very beginning has been Black Studies, BA, MA, PhD. And I'm interested in how, as you're doing this research and writing and sort of reflecting on your approach to it all, how does the fact that you haven't come to this research project, come to this work through a discipline and then made it into Black studies, but instead have always been this multidisciplinary scholar, thinker, teacher. How do you think that journey through Black studies and Black studies without a sort of foray into a discipline has shaped how you execute this and conceive this research project, but also how you conceive and run a classroom?
The way I want to answer that question, it kinda deals with this idea of non-disciplinarity,
Uh-huh.
right?
Yeah.
This idea of non-disciplinarity, I did start in Africana studies, but when I applied for undergraduate, majors and for undergraduate admissions, I applied for chemistry and African American history.
Mm.
I did start off thinking that I would be in a history department. As it turns out, I discovered Africana studies, and that I didn't have to be in a history department. And I built on those courses and took the major and ended up making this my career path. But I want to say something about the ways that Black studies exist to challenge, disrupt, and when necessarily abolish disciplinary lines. Because, in a sense, in the American Academy, it has been around gatekeeping, who gets to be arbiters of knowledge, who gets to be seen as experts in specific fields. And so often those people are not Black, they are not of African descent, they are not people of color, they are not women, right? So when it comes to who's determining the disciplinary boundaries, power is at issue, right? Uh, there are silences and absences for specific reasons around disciplinary lines, and I think Black studies exist to not only disrupt, but when necessarily, destroy those boundaries. When we think about method, when we think about not just the questions asked, but how do we go about answering these questions, and who do we turn to as experts on specific issues? As they say back home, trust and believe. Trust and believe. There aren't any new questions and solutions in terms of the issues that Black people face that Black people themselves have not already thought of, whether they be credentialed in a discipline or Africana studies or not. Right? So how do we look to community as their own experts, right, on these issues, as people who have already thought about solutions but did not have the resources to then implement those solutions? So I want to say something about the non-disciplinary leanings of Black studies, even though we do have some distinct methods in Black studies
Mhm.
that help us go about answering these empirical research questions and then doing something about it on the ground when we apply, you know, Black studies. And I would love for you to please repeat the second part of your question because I
Oh, I'm
think I
just
just answered
also
the first
interested
part.
how it shapes a classroom for you.
Mm, I, you know, I've been most of my post PhD life has really been dedicated to teaching. I have a robust, teaching history. And I actually went off to get the PhD because I wanted to teach at a high level. I wanted to teach on the college level.
Mhm.
And a part of my going to get the PhD in the first place was to do what I'm doing right now. And as an undergraduate, I was inspired by the professors that I had. I didn't know that being a professor also included serving on university standing committees and working as admin and
Yeah.
being provost. I didn't know that there was the provost, I didn't know that that's what professors also did administratively and in terms of the governance of the university. I didn't know that aspect. What I knew about professors was that they got to help mold the way I saw the world and absolutely changed my life. My professors in undergrad, Floyd W. Hayes, he changed my life. Dr. Lou Moses, who's now, the dean at an HBCU there in Raleigh, St. Augustine, but she is an English professor, right, who helped mold and change my life. Lawrence M. Clark, the second PhD out of the University of Virginia in mathematics. who was an African American man, was the second Black person with a PhD from the University of Virginia in mathematics. Also taught Africana Studies classes as a mathematician, also taught Africana Studies classes at North Carolina State. These people changed my life, and they also helped me, be affirmed in the classroom. I was affirmed in the classroom, but also in the world, is that when you leave this campus, there is a responsibility, not just as a Black educated person, but as someone coming out of Black studies, that you are in service of your communities, intellectually, professionally, and personally, right?
Mhm.
My pedagogy includes elements of, again, showing students how Black studies lives in the real world. I often bring in speakers who are not academics, guest speakers who are not academics, people who are what we call practitioners, right? So I have the clothing and Black expressive culture class. I brought in seamstresses. I brought in designers. These are
Awesome.
people
I
who
love that.
who don't, we have a workshop, an upcycling workshop, right? And so these are seamstresses and designers that actually walk us through an upcycling workshop. And I had my students in there on sewing machines. They were
Love
on
it.
sewing machines.
Love
In the
that.
clothing and Black expressive culture class, my pedagogy for another class I designed is a hybrid course where the class is activism and community. It is a seminar once a week, and then the other time is spent, the students are in the field. They are partnered with a community partner, a community organization that is Black led, in East Palo Alto, which is a town that was chartered by majority Black people. And they work in that community organization on specific projects that that community organization has identified, right? And so not only are we in the classroom talking about movement models, we're talking about the Black activist tradition from the abolition of enslavement to the prison abolitionist movement, right? We're talking about movement models. We're talking about the format of organizations and that history, but we are also very much thinking about the practical application of some of the strategies and some of the activist traditions that we find in our course content. How are these organizations engaging with that tradition, right? And what are they doing, and what are the issues that they have identified? The issues they've identified and solutions that they have began to undertake, where we can apply Black studies in that regard. And so my pedagogy is really, I think about theory and I think about praxis all the time. We're answering questions and having conversations in class. What can we do with it?
Mhm.
I'm the daughter of a seamstress, a sewing machine operator. My mother was a sewing machine operator for 40 years. My father was a factory worker, but he's a trained carpenter, so he's a woodsmith. My dad's a woodsmith and a trained carpenter, but he retired from the Paco factory, right? So he was a factory worker, both of my parents. And so I always think about, I got the head part of it. I have what's going on intellectually in my mind, but what can we do with our hands? um, and how do we put this to work? And my pedagogy is very much informed not only by that personal experiences and background, but the idea that you can do that with Black studies.
Yeah.
And so that has informed my pedagogy and how I understand my classes. And the idea of non-disciplinarity, or at least understanding multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary in a specific way. I have I have no problem transgressing in the classroom space. Like, I love bell hooks. I love bringing in, teaching to transgress, and points where, I learn from my students. This is not about professors professing and orating
Mhm.
and taking up space. I look for these opportunities for students to learn from each other, for me to learn from them. I look for opportunities for them to take up space in the room, for them to speak back to the text. But also, we are knowledge is a two-way process. It's a shared process, knowledge, and I enjoy activities and creating classes where myself as the teacher and students, we get to share in that knowledge making process. And that's what influences my pedagogy, the course content, the text that I use, and also the activities and discussions that we have in the classroom and what we might do outside of the classroom.
I'm so happy that you followed up and asked what was the second half of my question because
Oh,
that was such a that is a wonderful description of both the possibilities and the sort of real practices of Black Studies classrooms and its commitment to transgressing things like disciplinary boundaries. So,
mhm.
thank you for that. You
Thank you,
know,
John.
and I wonder if it gets sort of moving in this sort of direction like this. Response to one of the last two questions that I have for you. The first one is, what do you think that the field of Black Studies has historically done well, but also what do you think that it has not done particularly well?
What has it done well? I think the descriptive and recuperative elements, Black people have a history. Um, African diasporic peoples have culture, right? We have spent decades outlining how that is so
Mhm.
with evidence, right? And I think we've done that particularly well. And in certain instances, I think the celebratory aspects of courses that are celebratory in nature in terms of cultural studies and Black history, right? In particular, I think that has been done very well. What I think we need improvement and change around is sometimes the message is lost in terms of the different terminology and concepts and where that comes from and their application. So many terms and concepts have been so readily malleable to issues, concerns, and topics that actually don't benefit African descended persons. They don't
Hmm.
benefit Black people. I'm thinking about the ways in which the message was lost in the sauce around terms like women of color, right? And how that terminology was created as a unifying measure to gather together women of different ethnic backgrounds all around the world or the third world who had common struggles. Right. It was a measure to organize together, right, and to name themselves in terms of their shared struggle and understanding from the developed world and quote the third world, right. But things around that terminology, I believe, messaging had been lost. Messaging being lost around the ways that people engage with intersectionality,
Hmm. Hmm.
right?
Yeah,
Concepts like
for sure.
intersectionality. Um, I think that's something around messaging, but at least something around remaining consistent about this is where the terminology comes from. Always anchor that terminology in a specific history and intellectual tradition, whether we are engaging with it on campuses or if we're out in the popular, because sometimes concepts leave campus, you know.
Mm.
I
Yeah.
think, Kimberly Crenshaw talked about how, wait a minute, the world didn't find out about intersectionality until it left campus, and then all of a sudden we have political pundits and all sorts of people talking about intersectionality and then critical race theory and then, something around messaging and remaining consistent about what this is about, like what this terminology is about, how we've applied it, the reasons behind specific nomenclature and terminology to me, because the English language is versatile. We do so many things with terms and language, and next thing you know, a concept is set to mean anything. If it means anything, then it means nothing. If it can mean anything,
Yes.
then it
Thank
means
you.
nothing, right?
Yeah.
And so what we have done well, are and I think that we should still put forth effort in outlining African American history and contributions, the truth of African descended peoples' contributions to civilization, so on and so forth. Wonderful. The celebratory nature of some classes around Black culture, art, what we created, absolutely. In terms of the discursive measures and the function of this terminology and concepts that we've created in Black studies. I think there is some intervention to be made in how we understand these things,
Yeah.
and there's labor that we should do around making sure our messaging isn't lost. It's not all fun and games and celebration when we start to apply terminology in a way that makes it lose meaning and makes it lose, I don't know, its teeth
Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you. And maybe that's already an answer, but I'll ask this final question because that last bit I think is such a great response to this final question. But thinking in a Black Studies context, what is the issue you would want us to all be thinking about? What's the question you would want us to all be asking?
What we should all be asking, the issue, the question we should all be asking. I thought about this a bit, and I'm trying to find the best way to articulate this, knowing that I've engaged with very bright students. It was not an issue of them keeping up with the course content. Sometimes I had to keep up with them. Okay.
Hmm.
Um, my students have really done wonders in shaping the way I understand what I'm doing in this field and profession. I would say our responsibility to them in but the word I want to say is rationale, train of thinking. There is something being lost in the ways that students are rationalizing specific things. I just think that critical thinking.
Hmm.
We should be focusing on the ways we can employ Black studies in terms of critical thinking and basic skills. Um, honestly, I've engaged with students in the classroom where I am perplexed, but I think it is because of social media. It is because of um, these young people were born after the year 2000,
Yeah.
right? They have a different
I hate
language.
that, by the way. I'm so mad at you for saying that. I'm gonna delete this file. Yes.
Oh yeah,
They have
I'm
been born
sorry.
well into the 21st century, including my
Yeah,
own oldest kid, but
they're born well into the 21st century, and something around the steps through which you answer a question, you you reason, and critical thinking. I think we need to do a bit of work around critical thinking in the classroom. For example, I found that assigning a reading and reviewing that reading with students can take different formats in that I've assigned a reading and then I ask the students, okay, is there anything before I review, is there anything from the reading you'd like to affirm, challenge, or if there are any questions or ideas inspired by what you've read? And I just opened up the floor and let them talk. Okay, great. Another way to review is to do the same thing after you read out loud.
hmm, yeah.
So there was this point last term. We read the first 6 pages or so of the Combahee River Collective Statement. And that was the one of the best review sessions for reading that we had because we read it as a class. Every student took a paragraph, and we read it as a class, and I found out that some students didn't know what patriarchy was. I also found that students needed examples from their classmates on the areas of misogyny and sexism that they experienced because it was like a light bulb went off. It was like, the clouds parted for some of the
Mhm.
students because they read it out loud and they were listening to each other read
Interesting.
these things out loud. And because of all the tools available to students, the Chat GPT, the other AI text generating things where you can upload an article and it'll read the article for you and spit back study questions. And young people are not reading. They're not reading. They're not. And I hate to think that about students, but active reading is a part of critical thinking.
Yeah.
And one form of active reading is reading out loud, but, also active reading in terms of what should students look for when they're reading. This is like basic study skills, but also it pops up in the classroom in class discussions when we're reviewing, when you understand that students are not doing active reading. There's also the acronym, I think they call it RACE in the core curriculum for K through 12 is called RACE, but I rather call it PACE,
Hmm.
where you paraphrase, you answer a question, quote, right? You cite the quote and then you explain,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Just those basic steps, and this is how we're understanding the text, and this is how, we might engage with the concepts in discussion. There's some work that needs to be done around critical thinking and perhaps just that process, right? The process of it. And perhaps we are so focused in our special topics classes, perhaps the classes that we give an introduction to theory. Perhaps we don't feel that we need to go back to those basics because students should be exposed to that in their writing and composition classes freshman year,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Perhaps that's what we believe, but in a political sense, the reason why there's this slippery slope as far as politics in the classroom and how the outside world and what students bring with them in terms of their own culture and politics influences what they're doing in the classroom is because they're not seeing how to apply these critical reasoning skills in real life, in real time, and how they're engaging with headlines and on TikTok and hashtags and in their general conversation. Some of this stuff that we're doing in the classroom can really benefit them outside the classroom if we go back to basics. And I think that there are plenty of examples of how we can do that in Black studies using the work that comes out of Black studies.
What a great place to wrap up. Thank you so much for that. I think the idea that anyone from undergraduate through senior professor is somehow relieved of the constant need for basics is a it's a fatal presumption because there's something so much to be learned and a lot of pleasure there too. So,
Hmm.
um, thank you so much for
Yes.
this conversation, Kimberly. This I was really excited to talk, and you validated everything that Ashley and I always talk about. For people who have extensive background in the field of Black studies, the depth with which you've engaged these questions and questions at the heart of the field makes this just a really important and significant contribution to the series. So, thank you for your thoughtfulness and your time today.
Thank you. And thank you again, John, for having me. I have enjoyed this conversation. Just to let all your listeners know, I've been told I'm pretty fun as well. Like we we have laughs
Hey,
in the class.
this is totally fun. This is fun.
we
And yes, certainly, we can scold, mold, and make our students laugh. Um,
yeah.
I will say I love reading out loud. Sometimes students are like, we know how to read. I'm like, just listen, just read.
Hmm.
Although putting students on the spot to read out loud can, I think, reawaken some fourth grade traumas in them, but it's
Yeah.
worth it. It's worth it.
Yeah. No, I tell students they have the right to pass if they not comfortable.
That's good. Why did I not think of that? Okay. I will
Yeah.
start giving them the right to pass. Discourage it, but, go
Yeah.
ahead and read as you read. Anyway, well, thank you again. Your thoughtfulness in this has just been so great to listen to and converse and engage with you. So thank you for your contribution to the series. And yeah, thank you and have a great
Thank
rest of your day.
you. You too, John. You have a great week as well.
All right.
Yes.
Take care. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.